if there's ever a time where we needed to pull together as believers of Christ and unite and try to strengthen and make the world a better place, it's now.
Mm-hmm. And that sounds like he's preaching our message.
There's one body, one church, one spirit, one hope. The realities of the faith, the realities that unify us are already there.
Christ prayed for unity. What should we be praying for? I mean, it's the one prayer request of Jesus. Think about it. In the Bible, that we actually have a say in whether or not it comes to fruition or not.
I think in what God has done in you guys in this podcast and the multitude of folks that you're reaching, the diversity, whatever God intended when you started this, He's able to bring it to completion.
All right, everybody, welcome to the Whole Church podcast. I am one of your co-hosts, Joshua Knoll, here with the other co-host, the one and only, please give it up, TJ Tiberius Juan Blackwell. I assume they're still applauding. We wanted to offer a big special thank you to all of our patrons over on patreon.com. We could not do this show without you guys. Thank you so much for that. Today we're going to be talking about God's view on violence, the judgment of sin, and the history of Christian pacifism. So it should be interesting. But before we do, I'm going to review some audience engagement. This one was actually messaged to me from Christian Ashley. It was a long message. I'm only going to read part. He said, my heart has been burdened with the desire for unity within the church for a while now, and listening to people of various denominations and creeds voice the truth of Jesus Christ is an oasis in the desert of modern Christianity. So that was pretty cool. If y'all want to go leave reviews like that on Podchaser, that'd be great. And now, without further ado, we're going to jump to today's silly question. TJ, you want me to answer first, or you want to answer first?
It doesn't really matter.
All right, today's question is, what is your least favorite amphibian? I'll go ahead and go.
Sure.
I had to look up the name of them. I knew they existed, sort of. They're called Sicilians. They just look like really long worms with creepy teeth. I remember seeing them on Animal Planet forever ago when I was like a kid, and I just did not like them. They creeped me out. Upon looking up the pictures of them to make sure I pronounced the name right and everything, I realized that they still creep me out, so I'm sticking with my answer.
Yeah. And do you think you pronounced the name right?
Yes.
All right. My least favorite amphibian is Bupathi's purple frog. It's hideous.
What's it look like?
I can't. I'm not going to show you.
I'll look it up later.
I'm not going to it has like a tiny, tiny face. It looks like Charlie Kirk, but as a frog. It's awful. I hate looking at them. It is so bad. There's so many amphibians.
Oh, man.
But, anyway.
Yeah. So the real stuff now.
Right. Anyway, like Joshua said, we're going to be looking at the question of whether God uses violence and whether or not he is pro-violence. Specifically, we're going to be talking about Genesis 18 and 19. That's Sodom and Gomorrah. And this is our Dividing Scriptures series. If you've never heard one of these before, we just go through the Bible and discuss disagreements that we as Christians have and have had over certain passages or themes to see how we can have unity in our diversity of beliefs. As such, we try not to give our personal views. We do not aim to solve any arguments. We just want to talk about the views. On today's topics, on everyday's topics, throughout history, we just introduce what people thought, what people think.
Yeah. And
whether or not we can have unity and disagree on this issue.
Yeah. Because if your disagreement is, hey, you're not Christian, it's hard to have unity. But that's what we might be able to do. Let's see.
Yeah. So just go ahead and read some of the scripture that we're talking about today. Genesis 18, 20 to 23. Then the Lord said, "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is immense, and their sin is extremely dangerous. I will go down to see if what they have done justifies the cry that has come up to me. If not, I will find out." The men turned from there and went toward Sodom, while Abraham remained standing before the Lord. Abraham stepped forward and said, "Will you really sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" Skipping ahead.
Yeah. Before I read my part, I do want to point out for people, and I don't know, you probably noticed it.
Sure.
It's something we glance over as modern Christians. people were praying and crying out to God to punish these cities. And a lot of us as modern Christians haven't really experienced that kind of situation where we just desperately want God to punish someone for what's happening to us. So it's a different perspective on violence in this, and we'll talk more about that later. But so yeah, as TJ said, skipping ahead, this is near the end of chapter 19. After God just destroyed these cities, it says, early in the morning, Abraham went to the place where he stood before the Lord. He looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and all of the land of the plain, and saw that the smoke was going up from the land like the smoke of a furnace. So it was, when God destroyed the cities in the plain, he remembered Abraham and brought Lot out of the middle of the upheaval when he demolished the cities where Lot had lived.
Right. There's more than one place in the Old Testament where God uses destruction or physical harm
No way.
to bring about his ends in a situation. And, why don't you name some of those for us, Josh?
You mean like the flood?
Yeah.
The whole hell thing, what happened to Lot, which wasn't even Lot's fault, really.
Well, I mean.
Yeah, which I guess God didn't do. You just let it happen. Let's see. What he was going to do to Nineveh. There's places where it says he rained down hail on Israelites' enemies during the war, just to destroy part of that army.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of stuff.
Right. In Deuteronomy 28:47, 47 to 48, it says, because you didn't serve the Lord your God with joy and a cheerful heart, even though you had an abundance of everything, you will serve your enemies that the Lord will send against you in famine, thirst, nakedness, and a lack of everything. He will place an iron yoke on your neck until he has destroyed you.
Yeah, I mean, so that's an example.
Right.
Yeah.
And I will not give my personal views
You can hint.
in this episode. But perhaps there is more than one kind of destruction.
That's a deep question. We'll end this podcast there. No, so the argument comes in. So when we look at other passages of the Bible, we mentioned some of those of violence. There's also a lot of the Bible against violence. Hopefully, most of y'all are kind of familiar with these. They're a lot more popular in modern culture than some of the more gory verses. So in Matthew 5:39, Jesus says, someone hit you on the cheek, just turn the other cheek. Don't hit them back. Romans 12:19, Paul writes, he's quoting Isaiah, I believe. He says, vengeance is mine, thus says the Lord. Matthew 26:52-54, Jesus is the one who says, those who live by the sword die by the sword. A lot of us are familiar with that phrase. Hebrews 12:14, the author of that says to strive for peace with everyone. We mention that a lot on the Dividing series. We talk about it a lot. And then, of course, not to leave out the Old Testament, I know we mentioned Isaiah, but Ten Commandments also says do not kill. Some people argue that it says do not murder. Most people agree it's do not kill at this point. But yeah.
Yeah, and some people some people say that because Jesus was a pacifist, that we should also be pacifistic.
Yeah.
Yet, there are a couple spots in the Bible where Jesus seems to encourage violence or, is depicted as a great warrior. Specifically, Luke 22:36, which is actually my favorite Bible verse.
Yeah, I did know that.
Why'd you put it in here?
Because I thought
but anyway,
to talk about it.
Luke 22:36, Jesus talking to the disciples, and Jesus told the disciples to sell their cloak and buy a sword. If you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. Yada yada, purses.
You know what's really funny about that verse? To me.
What?
Afterwards, one of the disciples, and you got to read it for yourself because most versions just depict it hilariously. One of the disciples says, "But wait, Jesus, there's two swords over there," and Jesus says, "That's good enough." I just think it's hilarious.
Obviously, in the book of Revelation, it depicts Jesus as like this coming warrior, and 7-year war. Oh, Jesus is gonna kill a bunch of demons. I mean, does it count if it's against demons? Either way,
it's leading armies. Supposedly,
either way,
Satan has armies.
Either way, yeah. This is the problem with some of the Christocentric hermeneutics that try to compare all scripture to Christ and use him as justification for a pacifistic stance.
Yeah, which can talk about that later when we talk about historical people's views and stuff. So basically, right now, or throughout all of history, really, there's 6 main explanations for God's violence as depicted in the Bible that the church likes to kind of lean on. One would be divine immunity, and that's just this idea that God can do what he wants. He's God.
True.
And that whatever God does is just because he is God. Another one is that God has a just cause for everything. Even if we don't understand it, God has a good reason for why he did it.
Yeah, he has all 4 just causes.
What?
Just Causes video game series with 4 entries.
Some people argue that God just kind of, it's for the greater good. You watch Monk, the GG? Greater good? Yeah, anyway. Because some people say that God just acted differently in the Old Testament than he does now. One argument is that God was wrong to commit these acts like he was depicted doing in the Old Testament. And then another argument, which we'll talk about when we talk about Pete Enns later, that the writers did not depict God accurately, but rather with their own lens, not with God's lens. So those are kind of the 6 justifications or reasonings behind God's violence in the Bible.
Right, and with that, we want to come to our think tank segment. It's a group that we have on Facebook. There's 30 people in there, 30-ish.
Exactly 30 now.
30. Am I one of them?
Christian Ashley. Yes.
Oh, cool. 30 church leaders, mostly previous guests. We've got a ton of denominations in there, everything from Lutheran to Pentecostal. I feel like those are
Pentecostals.
Opposite ends of the spectrum.
We're Pentecostals.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I make fun of
we ask these people various questions to see how we can better direct the church into unity and to get everyone's viewpoints on this from as many different walks of life as possible. So, we asked a 3-word question. We said, is God violent?
Yeah. Just left it real simple.
Real open-ended.
See what they said.
We got a few answers. Some longer than others.
Yeah.
But Niles Merritt, friend of the podcast.
Yeah. He's been on now.
Been on as of last week, I believe.
2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago.
Mind-blowing.
Said that if righteous justice can be enacted violently, then yes. He went on to explain that violence is not a characteristic of God, but rather a result of his character towards sin. William Lovett, who we have not had on the podcast?
No.
Right.
Friend of Niles.
Yeah, friend of Niles always tries his best to respond to our questions.
Yeah, I believe he's a part of the Presbyterian Church of America.
He also affirmed that God can be violent when enacting justice, and he still does treat sin this way. Dr. Keith Sherlin, who we've had on a couple times now.
That was last week.
Right. Attested the word violence in this use, explaining that as a theological term, violence typically means an unauthorized and unjustified act against an unwilling participant. He basically said that the question was wrong, implying God is not violent by his definition of the word. He derived this definition from a Hebrew word, often translated as violence, that does have those connotations implied with it. He gave many examples of places in the Bible where that word is used, and we won't read that all to you.
Well, I will say, I've never spent that much time looking up definitions for violence before in my life.
Right, but boy, did he make a case.
Yeah, I learned a lot about the word.
We also asked which of these 6 main explanations of God's divine violence fits best with everyone's personal views. We had 1 vote for God has divine immunity, that everything he does is just because he is good. 1 vote for God has a just cause for everything he does, and 1 added their own option to say all of these are wrong. And what were the other options?
Yeah, so which is what we just talked about right before the dividing scriptures, right? So it was divine immunity. Everything God does is right. It's God has a just reason for everything. One of the other options was God did it for the greater good, the GG. One was that God just acted differently in the Old Testament. One was that God was wrong in the Old Testament. And one is that authors depicted God inaccurately, basically. And he said that all of those options are wrong. He basically was explaining that because there's no morality outside of God, it's just arbitrary to compare him to anything or to try and reason for ourselves why he's right, which is very similar to the divine immunity thing, but he thought that itself was arbitrary, so he also said that was wrong.
All right. Because Joshua also seemed to think that we would have enough time to talk about hell in one episode, we asked a couple questions on that topic that our think tank gave a few interesting answers to that we thought we would find helpful, thought you would find helpful. So we asked whether people viewed hell as annihilationist, a place of temporary refinement, a place of eternal torment, or if it was only figurative. We had 2 votes for eternal punishment, and 6 people voted for other, which...
Pretty much everybody voted other.
Which, that's just going to happen every time we ask a question on that group. That's the nature of the group. Joshua and Niles discussed a few different perspectives. They heard that hell is separation from God, which is attributed to C.S. Lewis, and that hell is being exposed to God's glory and being burnt up in it. No...
That's just so awesome.
Yeah, no deific sunscreen. Yeah.
No
for those
SPF
unfamiliar,
design.
This is Joshua. Most people call him Josh. If anyone was confused. Father Jonathan said, hell is the experience of God's love when it is rejected. Most of those who participated agreed we could disagree some about hell, but it is a necessity to believe in at least some kind of final punishment because a holy God requires holy judgment, which feeds back to our subject on divine violence. But that's all for our think tank segment. Now we want to look at what the church has historically believed about the issue before we consider how we can maintain church unity with all of these differences of opinion in place.
Yeah. Lots of disagreements, lots of different opinions, but I do believe there's room for unity. We'll talk about that in a minute. First, I want to look at some of the context that the church used for these arguments, right? So, even though he's not Christian, Aristotle played an important part in how we understand violence in the church. Because Aristotle was the one who first introduced the idea of just war to the West. So just war was his philosophy. Mind you, Aristotle is about 300s BC, so well before Christ. And his idea of just war was that war is only justifiable morally if it's used to prevent being enslaved, or if it's used to enslave people he considered natural slaves, which pretty much anyone who's not Greek, if you're Aristotle.
Yeah. Very strong opinions about that.
Yeah. And unfortunately, that idea, even his version, still kind of exists today. But the part that's important is he believed that war caused more harm than good most of the time. But in some cases, if you're preventing people from being harmed, and the war will end up causing less harm in the end, or if it's going to keep people from being enslaved, it's worthwhile to have war. So he called it just war and introduced that idea.
Right. But at the end of the day, it's just war, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we need to remember that for the first 3 to 5 centuries of the church, there wasn't an official Bible. There wasn't, this is the canonized Bible. So it's 3,500 years without that, right? And check out episode 42 if you want to hear more about that. Me and my brother, playing the role of TJ, talk about sort of how the Bible was canonized. If you're interested in that, check it out. But in the 2nd century, so before we had an official canon of the Bible, we have this guy, Marcion of Sinope, who is very important to all of these discussions. He came up with what might have been the first canon of anybody. So it's not an official canon. This is just his canon. He was one of the first ones to do it. And because he had this Christocentric view or philosophy, he said, only Jesus and Jesus' actions and Jesus' words matter. And then people pointed out, Jesus in Revelations, that's pretty violent. And he said, no, not that one. So he chose one gospel and 10 of Paul's letters. He carefully chose it so that none of them mentioned the Hebrew God, because he did not believe that the Hebrew God was the same as the New Testament God and Jesus, which is why he was also referred to as a Gnostic. But he also had his own belief that we call Marcionism. Most people today, which, we talked about with Niles the other day about caricatures, right? People just say, oh, well, you're just this, you're just that. And most people will now call Christian pacifists today you're just a Marcionist, or Marcionite is what they call them. because they say, you're just like that because you're saying we shouldn't have violence. And that's just not the case in a lot of times. A lot of times they don't only rely on Jesus. They're not saying the Old Testament God was different from the New Testament God. A lot of Christian pacifists still believe in the Old Testament God and all that, and it's not the same thing. But that is where that term comes from, and where we have that. And interestingly enough, Origen criticized Marcion.
Origin.
I looked at the pronunciation. It's
Origin. Okay.
Origen. He criticized Marcion, but not for the reasons you might think. He criticized him because he took the Bible too literally. Said, hey, you're too much of a literalist. Stop that. Because Marcion did not believe in allegorical interpretation at all, and Origen's ministry pretty much completely relied on that. So he didn't like that. But another major critic of Marcion, and the guy who basically was the one behind Marcion or Marcionites being labeled as heretics, was Saint Tertullian.
Tertullian. Right?
Yeah. Tertullian criticized Marcion with all the other Gnostics in his work De Carne Christi. Christi?
Christ.
Should have had you read this card. He claimed that Marcion misquoted Scripture and said that by denying Christ's flesh and his relation to the Old Testament God, he denies Christ's ability to save at all. And that's why that's called a heresy. However, we talked about how people use Marcionites and say Christian pacifists are all Marcionites. Tertullian was also a pacifist and wrote against violence in his work De Corona Militis. Chapter 11 is quoted a lot by Christian pacifists today still, so pretty important work.
Right. So, we just want to read from Tertullian. He said, I believe it was in The Military Crown, whatever that book was, the old law vindicated itself by the vengeance of the sword and plucked out eye for eye and requited injury with punishment. But the new law pointed to clemency and changed the former savagery of swords and lances into tranquility and refashioned the former infliction of war upon rivals and foes of the law into the peaceful acts of plowing and cultivating the earth. Many churches, like the Mennonite Church, use Tertullian's words on the matter to help form their pacifist doctrines today. Another defender of pacifism in the early church was Hippolytus of Rome, lived from the late 1800s to the early 200s.
Saw dragons.
Right.
Did you know that?
Yes. A soldier of the civil authority must be taught not to kill men and to refuse to do so if he is commanded, and to refuse to take an oath. If he is unwilling to comply, he must be rejected for baptism. A military commander or civic magistrate must resign or be rejected. If a believer seeks to become a soldier, he must be rejected, for he has despised God.
Yeah.
Right.
So basically, can't even be a soldier.
Yeah, but also look up the Hippolytus Dragons thing.
Yeah, I looked it up. Okay, so of course we know not all early church fathers were pacifist. There was still a big split on it, even in the early years of the church, but one of the church leader who was probably the most influential in this argument was St. Augustine of Hippo. He was around from the late 300s, early 400s. So, mind you, this is, 600-700 years after Aristotle came up with the just war. And most people attribute just war to Augustine. So that's kind of interesting. It's been around for more than 1,000 years by now. Augustine relied heavily on Aristotle's work whenever he did create this doctrine, and he kind of talked about it in The City of God, which is a book that he wrote in response to the fall of Rome in 476 AD. So what's happening in that situation is a lot of Christians had become Christian nationalists. They tied their Christian identity with Rome, thus the Holy Roman Empire even today, right? There's a pretty strong connection there. So they're like, oh, the fall of Rome, where are we? Are we still God's people? And he's like, yes, there's a different city. There's man's city. Then there's the city of God, which is what the book was about. But he also wrote it in response to a lot of Romans blamed Christians for refusing to fight in wars. Said, okay, listen, it's okay to fight, guys. That's kind of Augustine's view. So when he wrote this, he said it was okay for Christians to kill in service, and then separately said, to governments, there are just reasons to go to war. And he detailed what he thought those were. said if it creates more peace in the end, if it prevents more harm from happening than the war causes, if it is for just vengeance, is one that he added, and if it is to prevent slavery. Yeah, so that was Augustine's view, and that was largely accepted for quite a long time. Thomas Aquinas actually added to it in the early 1200s. He's like, yeah, he was right, but let me give you 3 really clear, this is it. So these were Thomas Aquinas' 3 criteria for a just war when he added to that doctrine. He said, 1, if it is in self-defense. You're defending yourself, fight. Mm-hmm. 2, he said, if it is to prevent a tyrant. Mm-hmm. And 3, he said, if it is to punish a guilty enemy. Right. That's fine.
Yeah. It's the only 3 smart things Thomas Aquinas ever said. Actually.
That's it? Just those 3 things?
Mm-hmm. Maybe only 2 of those 3. Hey guys, we just wanted to take a quick break to tell you a few ways that you can support the Whole Church podcast, your favorite church unity podcast.
Yeah, so you can sign up for our newsletter at our website or by emailing us at thewholechurch@gmail.com. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. You could share this episode on your own social media. You could donate to us on Cashapp with the tag that's in the show notes. You could follow us on Patreon at patreon.com/thewholechurchpodcast. You can subscribe to this show wherever great podcasts are found, or you could rate us on Apple Podcasts or Podchasers.
Especially that last one. It's a really great way for us to get recognition not only from the community, but from people looking to find new good podcasts.
Yeah. So let's get back to the show then.
Yeah. But anyway, a couple hundred years later, the Reformation started. 1500s. This is when more disagreements over the topic sparked up again, because, everyone listened to what Thomas Aquinas had to say. But Luther and Calvin, that's Martin and John?
Yeah. Martin
respectively.
Luther, John Calvin.
Both seem to agree with the idea of just war. However, John Wycliffe was a fairly steadfast pacifist. Wycliffe said Christians should always refrain from war under any circumstances, and that all crusades were heretical to true Christianity.
Yeah, which is always good when you're doing a Reformation. Be like, yeah, the Catholic Church ordained all those crusades. All the crusades are heresy. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, the Reformation happened for a reason.
Yeah.
If you listen to Greg Allison, it's still happening. Or talk to him in about a month and a half.
Fifth Crusade? Oh, yeah, go ahead.
So also during the Reformation, we have Menno Simmons, who was a Catholic priest, I believe. He was in the Catholic Church pretty heavily. But his brother was with the Anabaptist. The Catholic Church killed his brother. He ended up joining the Anabaptist and naturally wrote a lot about how violence is bad. From personal experience, he had a lot to say. So after his death, a lot of the Anabaptists became Mennonites, the ones that were following his teachings. That's where the Mennonite church comes from. And that's why they're pacifist.
All right. More recently, someone you all might have heard of, as opposed to a healthy majority of the names we've named, Martin Luther King Jr. was a pretty powerful opponent or proponent of pacifism for all Christians. Not a lot of people talk about his walk in the faith, but he did have one. He said, "We adopt the means of nonviolence because our end is a community at peace with itself."
Yeah.
That's what he wanted. He didn't want people to be violent to each other for any reason.
Our end goal is for all peace, which he explains, talking about heaven. If our end goal is heaven, everyone's going to be at peace. Why not just start doing that now? That's sort of his view on that. So even more recently, the debate has gained more traction as scholars like Dr. Pete Enns kind of takes a more pacifist view. Pete Enns has been on the podcast before, and he's going to be back on in December. So be looking for that. His argument was sort of what we talked about earlier when we gave the 6 options. He believed that the Israelite people, the people who penned the Bible, lived in a war-torn culture. It was the only lens that they knew. So when they talked about God, they talked about him from that lens. And that's not necessarily how God is. It's just the only way they knew how to portray God. Again, that's not necessarily what we believe, That's what he believes. That's sort of that side of the pacifist argument right now. Dr. Trimper Longman is going to be on in 2 weeks. Good friends of Pete Enns. Also argues in favor that God does use violence and that God supports violence in some instances, basically the just war kind of stuff. He points out, which we sort of mentioned earlier, our modern culture, we have not been enslaved. We have not experienced a lot of war. So for us, it's very foreign, the idea that we would need a just God to destroy someone else. And his perspective is sort of that is what justice looks like sometimes. And it's just hard for us to understand it as people in a more modern kind of cushy culture.
Right. This argument plays out practically in a few different ways that are significant. For the soldier who enlists in his country's military, it may be helpful to hear Augustine or Aquinas' words in support of a just war. We're going to talk about that more when we have Steve Lonclo on. That's soon. He was a chaplain. He knows what he's talking about. However, Christians do need to stand together to denounce the wrongful use of just war to justify their actions. Just to list a couple of things that are not just war. Abortion clinics, and specifically bombing them, actually. Shooting up massage parlors. Raiding the Capitol building.
Yeah. Unless, of course, the Capitol is a tyrant. That might fall on Augustine's view.
That's true. If it's being tyrannical, definitely within just war, and also your rights.
As
but
an
anyway,
American. Not everybody American.
As an American. The whole church cannot be united until we first become the church. There are some basics we have to agree on in representing Christ as the church, so the character of Christ must be a tier 1 issue, and his character will not allow these things to occur.
Referring to the raid on Capitol, shooting up places and all that. Yeah.
Most churches today agree with the just war doctrine. Those who take a more pacifistic view instead include the Quakers, the Mennonites, the Amish, the Wesleyan Methodist Church, the Seventh-day Adventist, and a few others.
So a lot.
Yeah.
There's a lot more that don't.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So again, like TJ said, we have to represent Christ. As the church, that's our job. So understanding the character of Christ is a tier 1 issue. And understanding there are some things that he simply would not do is a tier 1 issue. And we have to be willing to call some stuff out. Whether we condone war or not, though, whether if we're supportive of a specific war or not, that can be a 3rd-tier issue. We can go to the same church and not support the same war. That's fine. It might be heated, but with the power of the Spirit, we should be able to still have unity.
Yeah, the Second Boer War never should have happened. Whatever.
If you're a complete pacifist, however, you don't believe in any violence whatsoever, it might be a 2nd-tier issue. You know, you can still call the people who believe in just war theory your brother and sister in Christ. However, you're going to view certain scriptures wildly differently. You're going to have different opinions on how you should interact with the culture and that kind of stuff. So maybe go to a different church and still have overall church unity. So 2nd-tier for them.
We hope our time today with this issue has helped you understand the many different views we have on divine violence. As you know, a church, many churches, how we got to those beliefs that we all have, and that it helped bring us closer together in church unity, even if just a little bit.
All right, so for our one action to maintain unity today, we always like to end with just something practical you guys can just go out and do. We're just going to ask everybody, if you can think of someone that you still have a grudge against, someone in your heart or in your mind that just comes to you that you're like, yeah, I'm still kind of mad at them for this, or I'm still kind of hold a little bit of resentment, a little bit of hatred in my heart towards them for this reason. Well, first off, Christ said if you've hated someone in your heart, you've murdered them, so that's kind of a big deal. But try to let that go. Just let go of the grudge. Call up somebody, if you can think of someone, and let them know, hey, I forgive you. Very simple thing you can do right now. Just pray, see if someone comes on to mind. Call them and say you forgive them. If we all do this, I think we'll see more people open up. We'll see more people feel loved and connected to brothers and sisters that they haven't felt connected to because of these grudges. And in the end, that will lead to greater church unity, which is kind of our whole deal here. So
Right. And, naturally, every episode, we like to do a God moment, just a moment in our lives where we see God's presence, whether it's a challenge, moment of worship, blessing, yada, yada. I make Josh go first because it gives me more time to think. I do my best work on the spot. So, do you have a God moment for us this week, Josh?
No.
That's a lie.
Yeah, you're right. Man, I'm just blessed. I know I've been doing that a lot lately, but sometimes it's just true, and I like to just be thankful. And this is one of those times. In the last week, I got to go to Disney World. And when me and my wife went on our honeymoon, she didn't get to do a lot of stuff in Magic Kingdom because she was really tired come that day, and we got to do a lot of stuff she wasn't able to do before. I got to see 2 episodes of Falcon and Winter Soldier. Feel pretty blessed about that. Watched Mighty Ducks with my only hockey friend, so that was pretty awesome. And it's just been a great week. And I started a new job in like 2 days, so God bless.
Right.
Yeah.
So my God moment, I think this was Tuesday night. I was in Spinks. I was thirsty, as is one is wont to do. Me specifically. So I just walked in, go to the bathroom, whatever, get my drink, go to the counter, and I just see a dude buying what seemed to be a homeless person, just a meal, like one of those little packs of noodles, like a super, whatever they're called, the super bowls.
Couple noodles?
No, the big ones.
No. Super
meals, I think. It's like noodle soup. There's a bunch of flavors, but it was really cool. You don't see that enough. A lot of people just see them outside and ignore them.
Yeah.
Or don't ignore them, which can be much, much worse, in specific scenarios. But that was super cool. It's super nice to see people help each other. And, I like to think God influenced that decision.
Yeah.
But even if he didn't, that's someone working in a real godly way. So.
Yeah. Praise God.
Right. So, if you enjoyed this episode, that's it for the God Moments. Please consider sharing it with a friend. Super helpful for us. Listen to more of this series in the playlists in the show notes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Some future guests we're going to have our good friend Ken Hagerman, spelled wrong on the note card. Dr. Trimper Longman III, author of several works. He edited Josh's favorite commentary series. Returning guests, Sister Rose of the Catholic Campus Ministries at UNCW, and Father Jonathan of Holy Trinity Orthodox Church in Charlotte. And naturally, at the end of this season, we're going to have Francis Chan. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
How'd you pull that off?
I haven't yet.
Oh, okay. Oh, you're going to, though, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, cool.
One day.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening. Thank you so much for this amount of time. We appreciate it, and we hope you come back next week.
Yeah. Do-do-do-do-do-do.